Please have a seat.
Okay, ready to start? Good morning, everyone, and welcome to my very first speech at a Symfony event. I've never been here before, and it's very nice to be here to get to share with you some of my experiences with accessibility. My name is Sandra Eriksson, and I work at a company in Sweden called Funka in Stockholm. Funka is a consultant firm specialized with digital accessibility. Usability, accessibility, or both. Whereas usability is about how easy a product is to use, or a website or a service. Accessibility is about how you even get there. Neither of them should be excluded, or they should not be mixed up, because they are equally important. At Funka, where I work, we have a philosophy meaning that if you design an interface for the users with the biggest needs, it's going to work for everybody. There are approximately 50% of the world's population today that has at least one kind of disability, and that's more than 1 billion people. That's quite a few people. And for me, for instance, I was born with an eye condition called a cataract that normally affects elderly people, but sometimes it also affects children. And for me, accessibility has been present for quite some time now. And that's, I guess, the reason I come to work with this. And for me, my disability is permanent. I will have to live with it my whole life. And there's also temporary disabilities because of health issues or accidents. So is there anyone in here knowing someone with a disability? A few hands. I'd like for you to consider what kind of difficulties those people have. And there is a few groups of different kinds of disabilities. Vision, I have mentioned because I have low vision, and there's also users with blindness or color blindness. There's also the hard of hearing, users with deafness or just hearing impairments. Physical disabilities are those with mobility impairments or sometimes speech impairments. And there's also cognitive and neurologic disabilities such as intellectual limitations, ADHD, autism, epilepsy, dyslexia, and a few others. I'm going to talk about a screen reader a few times during this speech, and I'd like to describe what a screen reader is for those of you who have never heard about it. A screen reader is one kind of assistive software, basically mostly used by users with blindness or severe vision impairments, and also users with dyslexia. And what a screen reader does is that it reads the content on the screen aloud for the user. And it can also combine different kinds of features, such as speech and braille, and speech and magnifying, in my case, for instance. And there are a huge variety of screen readers on the market today, depending on the user's needs. There is the most sophisticated ones developed for users with blindness that is controlled solely by the keyboard. And there is the most primitive ones developed for users with dyslexia, which contains or provides click and read features. You select a piece of text and you ask the screen reader to read it out for you. And I would like to give a few examples of screen readers. One of the most common screen reader in Europe and the whole world, I guess, is a screen reader called JAWS, such as like the movie. And it's developed for the Windows operating systems, and it can be downloaded and tested for 40 minutes before you have to reboot your computer and start over. And there is another very competent screen reader called NVDA. It's open source and it's very powerful to use on the web, and it's a very good tool to test with as well. I'm going to show you what a screen reader sounds like in action.
We are what we do meetup Google Chrome RAD 1 column. Start a new group LANC, login LANC, sign up NAP, main landmark sign up LANC, list a med 6 object join a movement BSOC LANC, element list a dialog ruta, skip to content 1 AV, meetup logo, start a new group 3 AV, login 4 AV, sign up 5 AV 82. We are what we do meetup document. BSOC LANC join a movement.
So does this make sense to anyone? What is happening in this clip is that user is using the keyboard to navigate on a website, and eventually the user presses a couple of keys and a new window is opened with all the links, a list of all the links on the website. And with this feature, the user can choose a specific link and go and activate that link through this window. Of course, there is a few problems for users with screen readers. And one of those are buttons without labels. This is a mobile menu on a Swedish authority website. And the buttons in the right side of the menu is very difficult to use for a screen reader user because those buttons lack a label on them. And this is difficult because when the user finds those buttons with the screen reader is going to read button expanded, button expanded, button expanded. And there is no meaning to this at all. And when we look at the code, we can see that there is no label inside this button element, and that's why a screen reader cannot interpret what this means. It knows it's a button, but it doesn't know anything more. Another problem for screen reader users are live areas, or areas on a website where there's new content added to the page dynamically without the page reloading. And this is a problem because the user doesn't know there is something happening. And even though the user would know, the user would have to look for it and wouldn't find it until it's outdated, or gone for that matter. Captions is a problem for users with hearing impairments, and since it's very difficult to show something that doesn't exist, I choose to show you something, an example of a video that is very difficult to understand where there are no captions. This is a documentary about a movie, and they use a lot of voiceover effects in this video clip. And that is a problem because even though users with hearing impairments would be able to read on people's lips, that wouldn't be possible here because the person who speaks is not always visible. Unreachable objects is a problem for users with mobility impairments and users who navigate with the keyboard. In this picture, I have marked a few buttons, so-called, that are not possible to reach with the tab key. And when we look at the code, we can see that the reason to this is that those buttons are not real buttons. They are coded as images. Distractive content, such as video clips in the background of a page, can be very hard to handle for users with cognitive impairments. And in this, on this site, I couldn't find any way at all to turn off this video in the background. And this next example is, for me, I don't have any cognitive disabilities as far as I know, but for me this was a cognitive overload, because here there are jumping cars, there are blinking objects, and lots of strong colors. So this is a huge problem for users with cognitive disabilities. I had no idea people even developed websites like this anymore, but apparently. Low contrast is a problem for users like me with low vision and users with impaired color vision or so. And in this example, there's white text in front of a very bright image. And it's very difficult to read. With this image on the left, it's better. It's still a bit of a problem. But I wanted to show you this because the image to the right is much easier to read. And the only thing they have done here is that they have changed the color of the text and placed a white area behind the image, between the image and the text. So sometimes it's very easy to correct these kind of contrast problems. I like to watch movies a lot, so I hang around at the Internet Movie Database quite often. And on this website, there is a lot of links everywhere. And most of them are highlighted only by a different color. And that is a problem for users with disabled color vision, because showing you this in black and white, it's very difficult to perceive what text are links and not. And even though this kind of color blindness is very rare, it still exists. And you need to be aware of this problem. So there is a few ways to achieve and measure accessibility. And one of those ways is to learn how to interpret and use WCAG. WCAG is, I choose to pronounce it WCAG. There's a few ways you can pronounce it, but it's probably the easiest way. And it stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's an international standard developed by the World Wide Web Consortium. And the current version of WCAG was released in 2008. So that is WCAG 2.0. And the new legislation in Europe is based upon WCAG 2.0. There is also an EN standard with a very interesting name, 301549. It doesn't say you anything, but it's an European standard that is based upon WCAG. Except there are a few exceptions, but basically the EN standard is pointing to WCAG. And I suppose you've heard about the Web Accessibility Directive. And the Web Accessibility Directive is also based upon the EN standard. So everything goes back to WCAG. In June this year, there was a new version of WCAG released, WCAG 2.1. And it's just WCAG 2.0, but it contains a few more success criterions. WCAG consists of 4 main principles, which I will explain in a few minutes. And there are 13 guidelines and 78 success criteria. And that's quite a few, so I will not go into every one of those. I will just give you an example of one success criteria in each principle. Those guidelines are, or success criteria are divided into 3 different levels: A, AA, and AAA. And in order to meet the new legislation, level A and AA are required. So the first principle is perceivable, and it means that all content that is not in text should be described in text in some way. And of course, there is a few exceptions, such as CAPTCHA features that provides us an alternative to a CAPTCHA image, for instance. Or there's also images for decoration and time-based media, such as live send audio or radio, video, or similar. And a very good example of this kind of content that needs to be described is images and photographs. And in this image, I think very well described alt text is used, because it describes very well what is happening in this picture. And what this means is that when a screen reader user finds an image, the screen reader is going to announce that there is an image and read out the text inside the alt attribute. If the alt attribute is left empty, that means that the screen reader interprets the image as decorative and will ignore it. When it comes to images without any alt attribute at all, a screen reader is going to try to interpret the image probably will be reading the address to the image, which is very difficult for a user to understand. So always use the alt attribute, even though it's empty, because that means it's a decorative image. But preferably describe images that has a meaning for the content. The second principle is operable, and it means that users navigating using the keyboard should be able to navigate through an interface using only the keyboard. And this is an example what this looks like when a user navigates through a website using the tab key. The third principle is understandable, and this one is a bit more blurred because it's very difficult to measure. You never really know when a person understands the content or not, but there are a few success criteria that is good to have in mind, such as navigational mechanisms on a website, for instance, such as top menu or a left menu. They should never change order or change place or location on the page. They should be consistent throughout the website. And this website has a top menu. And the top menu has the same order throughout the website. And also, in every section, there's a left menu in a sidebar in the left side of the web page. So the user always knows what to expect. The fourth and last principle in WCAG is robust, and it means that the code should be robust. And this success criteria is one of the new in WCAG 2.1. And it says that when there is a status message on a website, a user with assistive technology should be able to perceive this, but the focus should not be affected. This means that if a user is filling out a form or something and the internet connection is lost for some reason, the user should receive this information, but should be able to continue doing whatever he or she is doing. And this is done with a small attribute called ARIA Live, which I will describe a bit more later. Accessible coding is not really a thing, but there's a few things to think about when you code and to achieve accessibility. First of all, think accessible from the beginning, because it's much more costly to try to achieve accessibility later in the process. So think accessible early in your development process, and and also this is a very good thing to do. This is to pick a code standard and then stick to it. For instance, HTML5 is a very good. It provides very good elements to inform, for instance, screen reader users where they are on the website. And I have shown you earlier in this presentation a few problems when it comes to buttons, for instance. It's very common that buttons are programmed with span elements or images. A very good way to stick to a code standard is to code buttons the way they should be interpreted by users. ViAria, what is that? Well, ViAria is a set of attributes that can be added to native HTML5 elements and native HTML objects, whatever version, really. I have already shown you a few. ARIA Live is one of them, and it's used for describing content that is dynamically added to a site. Another one is ARIA Expanded, which I will show later as well. And keep it simple. Less is more. Complex interfaces requires complex code, and complex interfaces are also much more difficult for the user to understand and use, and complex code is generally more difficult for developers too. ViAria can be used for a lot of things. There are so many attributes in ViAria. You can, for instance, use a ViAria attribute to tell that an element should be interpreted as a button, but there are already HTML objects to do that, so there is no reason to use ViAria for that. So use ViAria native objects and ViAria when it's needed, and ViAria is mostly needed when it comes to dynamic content. And finally, test your code. And there's a few ways to do that. The first that might seem the most costly and time-consuming way of testing code and interfaces is to test with real users. It doesn't have to be that complicated, but it's a very good way to discover usability and accessibility problems that can be very difficult to predict. For those of you who would like to try your website and see how well it works using the keyboard, let go of the mouse and try to navigate through the website with only the keyboard and the tab key. And there's also a way you can also try a screen reader. For instance, I can highly recommend you to try NVDA because it's because it's open source. It's quite easy to use, and it's also very powerful on the web. For those of you who doesn't use the Windows operating system, you have, or maybe you use Mac, there's a built-in screen reader in Mac OS called VoiceOver, and it's also available on pretty much every iPhone and iPad today. And if you use a computer that allows you to turn off the screen, which doesn't really comply with iMacs, but with a traditional PC, for instance, try to use a screen reader and turn off your monitor and see how well that goes, because I think it's going to give you a very good impression how difficult it can be to navigate on a website or use any interface only with a screen reader. Funkify is a Google Chrome add-in that can simulate different kinds of disabilities, specifically for different kinds of cognitive disabilities. And you can see how well your website works. And when I analyze websites and write my audits for my customers, I rarely use automatic tools. There are quite a few on the market, and I cannot really recommend any of them. But what I do most of the time is that I validate the code, because the W3C's validator service can point out a few accessibility problems. There is also a few. There's also one automatic tool called Site Improve. It can produce very long reports on how well your website, how accessible your website is. But one thing to be aware of when it comes to automatic tools is that they are very good at analyzing the code. They can, for instance, see how you use the heading structure or landmarks such as the main footer, nav, and header elements in HTML5, but they are not very good at looking at the understanding the more softer problems, which is very relevant for users with cognitive disabilities. They cannot see that a website is messy or not logic, or that's very important to remember. So an automatic tool it's not going to solve all problems for you. And if none of those ways are enough, then I would suggest you can talk to an expert about accessibility. I have a few tips and tricks. I showed you those buttons for a few minutes ago, and they had no labels in the first slide. In this slide, they do have a label, but it's still not visible. And this is because of this class here, the SR-only class in Bootstrap, in this case. And what this class does is that it shrinks the label to only 1 pixel wide and 1 pixel high. And it also puts out the label outside the visible area of the screen. This means that nobody's going to see it ever, but a screen reader will. And the screen reader is going to read this label for the user so that the user can understand what this button is for. This is the Bootstrap toggle buttons. And I earlier mentioned that there is a few attributes you can use or should use to describe that those buttons are expandable. This is done with the ARIA expandable button, ARIA expandable, and this attribute is necessary to use because there is no way in HTML to do this so that the screen reader will understand it. And what this attribute does is that it reads out the current status of a toggle button. So it's going to read that the button is expanded or minimized, depending on the screen reader. Different screen readers pronounce this in different ways. But the principle is the same. The user is going to understand that the button can be expandable and that there is new content underneath it. There is also another attribute here called ARIA controls. And it's a good complement. It's not necessary in order for the ARIA expanded to work. It basically gives the screen reader specific instructions on how the user can go directly to the new content. But it's not necessary. ARIA expanded is going to work anyway. It's going to work even though you leave this out. There's some problems with dialog boxes, and there's a few different kinds of dialog boxes. In those two examples, those are not really dialog boxes, but they do cover a huge part of the screen. In the left example, it's actually from the Symfony website, and this blue frame here points out where Google Talkback, which is Google's screen reader on Android devices, what this screen reader is reading this very moment. And it looks like that the screen reader is reading inside the menu, but it's actually reading behind the menu. And this is a problem because it's going to be very difficult for a user to find this menu. And the problem is almost the same on the right image, but in the right image, it's a user navigating using the keyboard. And when the menu is opened, the user ends up in the background. This is the Bootstrap dialog box, and some of the Bootstrap code. And what I wanted to show here is one way to solve this problem. And it's to hide all content except the dialog box. And this is done with the ARIA hidden attribute. And it's very convenient when it comes to designing mobile menus and dialog boxes generally. So in this code, the ARIA hidden is added on all containers except the modal window. This is also a clip, and it demonstrates how difficult it can be for a user to perceive where the focus is navigating using the keyboard when there is no visual focus effects. And because of this, the user is going to end up on the wrong page. Sometimes front-end developers tell me that they don't want to use visual effects because they're so ugly. Well, you don't have to make them ugly. It's very simple not to. And I'm going to show you a very nice example of very nice-looking visual effects. And I can also say that users navigating with the keyboard who are depending on those effects are never going to think, oh, this is so ugly, I don't want to use those. They're going to think, wow, this is cool because I can actually see where I am. Skip to content links has been around for a few decades now, and they provide a link for the user to skip a navigation menu. On this website, for instance, there's a huge top menu with many, many links inside of it. And to make it easier for the user to skip this and go directly to the main content of a page, a skip to content link is used. And it should be placed as the first focusable object on a site. And it should also be visible as well when the user focuses on it, because if it's completely invisible, only screen reader users will be able to use it. And this is a feature that helps users with mobility impairments as well that navigates with keyboards or similar techniques. And this is what it looks like in code. So I'm not very familiar with Symfony. I have never tried to code anything with Symfony, so you are the experts about Symfony here. But there is a few things worth mentioning when it comes to Symfony and accessibility. This is code generated by the standard Symfony div theme, and there's a few problems with this code. First of all, the radio buttons here are not grouped in a very good way because they are only grouped with the div element, and those are not, they don't have any real meaning for users with assistive technology. And another problem is how the error message is coded as well. The users with screen readers will eventually find this, but they will have to look for it themselves. So I'm going to show you how you can use the Bootstrap theme instead. And for those of you who know Bootstrap, you already know how to include Bootstrap, CSS, and JavaScript on a page. And I suppose you also know how to use Bootstrap on your entire site by configuring the config files. And this is the code that the Bootstrap form theme generates. And I have highlighted the first piece of code here because this is one of the differences. First of all, the whole group of radio buttons are placed inside a field set element, which tells screen readers that those fit together. And the legend element describes what the context is. So for instance, this is, I can't really see what it says, but it's, and there's also how the error message is coded here, because it's coded as a part of the legend element, which means that if the user fails to make a choice here, the screen reader is going to announce that there is an error message automatically. So the user is not going to have to look for it. So those are the two main differences. And this is the forms that is generated with this code. And in order to display those error messages, you also need to disable the HTML5 validation, because those are not very accessible at all. They are just as tooltips, and those are not accessible for users with assistive software. So in order to disable those, you need to set the no validation to no validate attribute to no validate. So by going back to the 15% of the world's population I mentioned earlier, I would like you to consider that those are your potential customers. And by designing interfaces in an accessible way, that will lead to better UX and also to more revenues for you and for your customers as well. So today I have, this is what I've talked about today. You've learned a few things about different kinds of disabilities and common accessibility problems. You now know the 4 main principles in WCAG and how to code accessible and how to test accessibility. And of course, a few tips and tricks. And there are no more excuses. So go ahead and make your interfaces and code more accessible. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me today, and I hope you will enjoy the rest of the event. Do anyone have any questions? I will be here for most of the day, so if anyone have any questions, I will try to answer them.
Is it acceptable to have like a switch where you can switch on accessibility or switch it off?
No, I would say not really, because then you leave it to the user to switch on accessibility. I'm not really sure what you mean with switched on and off accessibility.
Well,
but
I know some web designers like to do things really fancy, but sometimes you can persuade them to do two versions. So one version would be more accessible and the other one not. So it'd be more fancy. So is there like a standard or something that says, look for this to say that this is an accessible website, or you can make it accessible?
In some way, I would say it's okay, but the problem is that, once again, you leave to the user to make this decision, and if you code this switch or whatever in a way that the user cannot interpret or understand, you will have a problem, because then your solution is not accessible.
Well, that's the bit you have to get right.
Yeah, exactly. So the point with accessibility generally is that you make your interface accessible for everyone to use. There shouldn't be. It's like going back to the websites. You have one web website, and you have the original website, and it's also go against all responsive design as well, because you don't want to be limited in the responsive interface. You want to be able to reach all functions or features in a mobile view. You don't want to have to switch to the desktop view. So I would say no, don't do that, because then it's just an what do you say? I tried to find the words. It's a secondary. It would be a secondary solution, and you would have to maintain two different sites as well. So
that answers the first person's question.
Yeah. So please don't do that. So yeah, I will get back to you, host questions I was not able to answer. So thank you.